Welcome to Create More Intimacy, a podcast for men. I'm Elisa Stoddard, and I help successful men stop chasing sex and start building real connection so they finally feel close, connected, and wanted again. There's a moment that keeps happening, and you already know exactly what I'm talking about. It starts small. A comment, a question, something your partner says that on the surface shouldn't be a big deal, but something in you tightens anyway. You feel it in your chest first, then in your jaw, and before you've really had a chance to think about it, your tone shifts. You get sharper, more forceful, and in that moment it feels totally justified, like you're holding your ground, like you're getting control of a conversation that's starting to go sideways and someplace you don't want it to go. But it ends the way it usually does. She pulls back or pushes back, and later, when things are quiet again, you're left sitting with it. That mix of frustration, guilt, and awareness that you did not show up the way you want to. And if this has happened more than once, you've probably heard some version of the same feedback, that you're angry more often than you think, and that it's hard to talk to you when things get tense. Part of you hears that and genuinely wants to do better, but another part of you is still thinking, yeah, but she doesn't understand what I was dealing with in that moment. So you end up stuck between knowing something needs to change and not fully seeing what is actually driving it. Because what feels like control in that moment is often the exact thing that's quietly eroding how you're experienced by the person you care about most. And most men never really look at that part. They try to manage the reaction, keep it together next time, and say it differently. But they never actually understand what's happening underneath it. So what I want you to do in this episode is slow down that moment. Not just what you did, but what got you triggered, what you were trying to avoid, and why anger becomes the move that you go to, even when it's costing you trust, connection, and respect. Because once you can see that clearly, you're not stuck trying to control yourself anymore. You actually have a different way to handle the moment when it starts to build. Welcome to episode 52, Why You Get Angry in Conversations Even When You Don't Want to. I had a client who came to me with this exact pattern. Successful, respected in his field, ran his own practice, the kind of guy that most people looked at and assumed that he had all the things handled. But both at home and at work, there was this pattern that kept showing up. When he felt questioned, when someone pushed back, when he didn't immediately have an answer, his tone would shift in the same way that I just mentioned. He'd raise his voice, get sharper, sometimes cross the line into being cutting or dismissive. And in his mind, it made sense. He thought he was maintaining standards, keeping people in line, making sure things didn't spiral into something unproductive. But when we slowed it down and really looked at what was happening, the dynamic was a lot clearer. At work, people complied, but then they avoided him. They didn't bring him problems early. They filtered what they said. They did just enough to stay out of his way. What he got wasn't respect. It was resentful compliance. And at home, it created distance. Conversations that could have been worked through got shut down. Not because they were resolved, but because it didn't feel safe to stay in them. So at one point I said something to him very directly. I told him, you might think this is working for you, but you're the guy everyone is managing around, not the one they actually trust. And none of that landed as a surprise because he already felt that. He just hadn't connected it to what he was doing in those moments. And that's the part that most men miss. They think the problem is the reaction itself, the raised voice, the frustration, the tone. But that's just the visible part. What actually matters is what's happening in the few seconds before that. Because that's where the pattern is being driven from. If you actually slow this down, what you'll see is that these moments are not random. And they're not just about having a short temper. There's a predictable sequence happening underneath this. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It starts with a trigger, something that activates you, but not in the way that most people think about triggers. It's not just what was said. It's how what was said is being interpreted in real time. A question, a disagreement, a shift in tone, something that maybe on the surface seemed neutral or manageable, gets processed internally as a problem. And more specifically, as a potential threat to how you're being seen. Like the competent one, certain, in control, respected. That happens fast, usually outside of your conscious awareness. But you do feel it. That tightening in your chest and that pressure in your jaw and the shift in your breathing, that's the moment your system is registering something about this isn't safe for how I want it to be perceived right now. And this is where the pattern actually starts to take shape. Because once that internal interpretation is made, your focus shifts. You're no longer in the conversation to understand or resolve things. You're in it to manage perception, to reestablish control, to move the interaction back into a position where you feel certain again. This is the part that most of you don't catch. The reaction that follows, that sharp tone, that defensiveness, that escalation, it's not just emotion. Guys, it's a strategy. It's a fast, learned way of shutting down anything that feels like it could expose uncertainty, your loss of control, or the possibility that you don't have the answer in that moment. And it works, at least in the short term. The conversation shifts. The pressure drops. You regain a sense of control. But there is a trade-off happening that you don't feel immediately. Because while you're managing how you're perceived in that moment, you're also shaping how you are experienced by others over time. And those are not the same thing. In the moment, you might come across as forceful, decisive, in control. But over time, what people actually experience is someone who is really hard to approach, somebody super rigid, someone difficult to be honest with, and unpredictable when things get tense. And that's where the erosion happens. It's not from one blow up, but it's from the pattern. And this is why just trying to stay calm doesn't solve things. Because you're still operating inside the same sequence. You're still interpreting certain moments as threats to your identity. You're still trying to manage perception instead of staying in the conversation. You're just attempting to do it with a different tone. And eventually, under enough pressure, the old response pattern comes right back. So if you want this to actually change, the work isn't at the level of the reaction. It's at the level of what you're making those moments mean and why your default move is to control how you're seen instead of staying present in what is actually happening. Once you understand that this isn't just about anger and that there's a sequence driving it, the next step is being able to catch your version of it as it's happening. And this is where most men stay too general. They'll say things like, well, I just get triggered when she criticizes me, or when she comes at me that way, I lose it. But that's still surface level. Because the trigger isn't just the situation, it's the meaning you attach to it in real time. Two men can hear the exact same sentence and have completely different reactions because of what it represents to each of them. So if you're actually wanting to get ahead of this pattern, you have to get more precise. Not just what happened, but what did it mean to you in that very moment? Was it, she thinks that I'm wrong, or I'm losing control of this conversation, or was it, I don't have a good answer here and that's about to be exposed? Because that interpretation is what creates the internal pressure. And once that pressure starts to build, your system is going to look for the fastest relief valve. For a lot of men, that's where the anger comes in. Not because anger is the core issue, but because it's effective. It shuts things down. It shifts the dynamic. It buys you space and time, and it puts you back in a position where you don't have to sit in uncertainty. But here's the part where I want you to be brutally honest. In a lot of those moments, you're not just reacting, you're avoiding. Avoiding the feeling of not having the answer. Avoiding the discomfort of being questioned. Avoiding the possibility that you might not be handling something as well as you think you should be. And instead of staying in that and working through it, the reaction just cuts it off immediately. It moves the conversation away from whatever was about to be exposed into something that you can control. And if you don't look at that directly, it's very easy to keep justifying the reaction. Easy to tell yourself that it was necessary, that it was warranted, that the other person pushed you there. But when you really slow it down, the pattern is a lot more predictable than that. There are certain types of moments that consistently create that internal type of pressure for you. Certain conversations, certain tones, certain topics. And inside those moments, there are specific things you don't want to feel or you don't want to be true. That's your actual trigger. Not the situation, but what the situation represents. And once you can start to see that, something shifts. Because now you're not just reacting to what's happening externally. You're aware of what's happening internally in real time. You can feel the moment where it starts to build, where your body tightens, where your thinking narrows, where your focus shifts from understanding to controlling, to damage control. And that awareness is what creates the opening for something different. Not immediately changing the outcome, maybe, but interrupting the automatic nature of the response. Because right now, for most men, this sequence is fast enough that it feels like there is no space to slow it down and choose something different. It just happens. But when you can identify your specific triggers and what you're actually trying to avoid, that space starts to appear right there. And that's where the work actually begins. Once you see the pattern, the uncomfortable part is what comes next. Because at that point, it's not just something that's happening to you. It's something that you're participating in. And this is where I'm going to challenge you a bit, because most men don't like looking at this part directly. In those moments, when you feel that pressure building, when you feel yourself getting pulled toward reacting, that is the moment that you are making a decision. Granted, when you don't understand this, it might not be consciously, but it is still a decision. You are choosing short-term control over long-term respect. You're choosing to shut the moment down instead of staying in something that feels uncertain. You're choosing to protect how you're seen right now instead of strengthening how you're experienced over time. And I want you to really sit with that, because it is so easy to tell yourself that you just lost control like once. But if you look at it closely, there's a part of you that knows exactly what you're doing. You know that raising your voice is going to shift the dynamic. You know that getting sharper is going to either push the other person back or escalate things to a point where the original issue totally gets lost. That is why it's effective. And that is also why it keeps costing you. Because every single time you do that, you reinforce a bad pattern. It's not just internally, but in how other people relate to you. They learn what happens when things get tense. They learn how safe it is or isn't to be honest with you. They learn whether they can stay in a difficult conversation with you or whether they need to manage around you. And over time, that becomes your reputation in your relationship. And in a lot of cases, outside of it too. This is why the idea of just staying calm is so limited. Because calm on its own doesn't require you to face anything. You can stay calm and still avoid. You can stay calm and still deflect. You can stay calm and still control the outcome of a conversation in a way that keeps you from being exposed. What actually requires something different from you is staying present. Staying in the part of the conversation where you don't immediately have the answer, where you do feel questioned, where something about your position isn't as solid as you want it to be, where you might need to pause, think, or even admit that you don't know. And for a lot of men, that's the real edge. Not the emotion, but what the emotion is trying to pull you away from. Because staying there requires a different kind of strength. It requires that you tolerate that internal pressure without immediately trying to get away from it. To let the conversation stay open a few seconds longer than you were comfortable with. To prioritize understanding over control, even when control is available to you. And if you're honest, that's not something that you've practiced. You've practiced being decisive. You've practiced having the answers. You've practiced moving things forward quickly, but you haven't practiced staying in a moment where none of that is immediately accessible. So your system defaults to what it knows, which is why this keeps repeating. And it's not because you're incapable of handling things differently. It's because you haven't built the capacity to stay in the part of the conversation that's uncomfortable yet. And until you do, you are going to continue to reach for the same move over and over, even when you know it's not getting you what you actually want. So if you take everything that I've just talked about, the pattern, the trigger, the need to control how you're perceived, the question then becomes, what do you actually do in the moment when this starts to build? And instead of giving you something complicated, I want to give you one thing to focus on. It isn't controlling your reaction. Not trying to say the perfect thing, just this. When you feel that moment start, when you notice the tightening, the pressure, the shift in your tone, your only job is to stay in the conversations just a few seconds longer than you normally would when you're trying to take control of it. That's it. Because right now, the pattern is immediate. You feel it and you move to shut it down. You redirect, you escalate, you override. But what you haven't built is the ability to stay. To let the moment exist without immediately changing it. So instead of focusing on what to say, focus on not escaping. Let there be a pause. Let there be a moment where you don't have the answer. Let the other person finish what they're saying without interrupting or correcting. And pay attention to what comes up for you in that space. Because that's the part you've been avoiding. That's where the discomfort is. That's where the uncertainty is. And that's also where the opportunity to do something different is. Now, this is going to feel really unnatural at first, for sure. It's going to feel like you're giving something up, like you're losing control of the conversation. But what you are actually doing is shifting the way you relate to it. You're moving from managing how you're seen to actually engaging with what is happening right in front of you. And that's what builds trust. That's what changes how you're experienced over time. Not in one perfect response, but a different way of showing up consistently in these moments. And if you can start doing that, as clumsy as it will be at first, you'll start to notice something. The intensity of those moments starts to change. The conversations don't escalate in the same way, and you don't walk away from them with that same level of regret and guilt. And I also want to be clear about something. Understanding this and even applying it a few times doesn't mean the pattern is gone, because this is something that has been reinforced for years. It's tied to how you handle pressure, how you see yourself, how you've learned to navigate situations where you don't feel fully in control. And changing that takes way more than just awareness. You actually have to work through your specific pattern, your triggers, and build the capacity to stay in those moments consistently. So if you're listening to this and you're recognizing yourself in it, not just in theory, but in a very real way, where you can think of specific conversations, specific moments where this is played out, and you know it's costing you something in your relationship, this is exactly the kind of work I help my clients with. Not just intellectually understanding the pattern, but in changing how they show up while it's happening. So they handle these moments without defaulting to control, without shutting things down, and without walking away feeling like they didn't show up in the way that they can be proud of. If that's something you're ready to actually work on, you can book a call with me through the link in the show notes. We're going to look at your specific situation, where this pattern is showing up, and what it would take to start shifting it in a real way. And if nothing else, take this and start paying attention to that moment, not after it happens, right when it starts, because that's where you have control to change everything. Take care. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. If something in this episode hit home, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps more men find the support they need. And if you are ready to get help or take the next step, you'll find the link to book a free call in the show notes. I'll see you next time.